What's the one thing you'd say to your younger self before your first betrayal?
I didn't even flinch when the message came through. It was early December, a Tuesday if I remember right, and I was sitting on the couch in my apartment, sipping what was supposed to be a calming cup of peppermint tea, but tasted more like warm regret and unsaid things. The text from Natalie popped up in the family group chat, just a breezy little line, like it didn't mean anything. Hey everyone, thinking of keeping things small this year. Just immediate households. Hope that's okay. Followed by a snowflake gif, because apparently, softening the blow with animation is our family's way of communicating anything remotely real. Now, I could have said something. Could have replied with a polite protest or asked what small really meant, or whether we'd be doing a virtual gathering, or if I could maybe drop off gifts on the porch like we did during that one awful COVID year. But I didn't. I just stared at the message for a long minute, reread it twice, and then locked my phone screen. There was something in my chest, not quite anger, not quite sadness, just a heavy, familiar weight, the kind that doesn't make you cry, just slows you down. Here's the thing, I wasn't surprised. Not even a little. I've always been the outlier in the family, not in the obvious dramatic way, like storming off at Thanksgiving or refusing to bring a casserole. More like a slow drift that no one ever talks about, but everyone silently agrees on. I left home when I was 22 and never came back, at least not for long. No kids, no husband, no Sunday brunches or church picnics. I built my life in the city, chased things they didn't understand, boardrooms, late nights, impossible goals, sharp suits. My victories were in contracts and press releases, not in potlucks or baby showers. They didn't hate me for it, let's be clear about that. They just didn't quite know what to do with me. Over the years, I stopped getting questions about my personal life. Conversations at holidays became surface level, work keeping you busy, and still in New York, as if those two facts summed up everything they needed to know. I used to try harder, bringing expensive gifts, asking about their kids' soccer tournaments, baking things from scratch to impress my mother, but nothing ever landed. I was always either too busy or too fancy or too something. And at some point, you stop trying to be understood when the people around you have already made up their minds. So when that message came through, telling me we were keeping it small, I knew exactly what it meant. I was being cut out, wrapped in the soft gauze of logistics. And the worst part wasn't even the exclusion, it was the familiarity of it. This wasn't a rupture. It was the continuation of a slow erasure that started years ago. A holiday without me wasn't an exception. It was a graduation. Still, I told myself I was being dramatic. Maybe they really were scaling things down. Maybe finances were tight. Maybe my sisters-in-laws were flying in and space was limited. Maybe I really had just grown too far apart. I busied myself with work, drowned in spreadsheets, focused on the upcoming interview my PR team had secured, a live, nationally televised segment scheduled for Christmas night, no less. I smiled at the timing, quietly grateful for the distraction, the sense of purpose. If my family didn't need me for Christmas dinner, then fine. The world, apparently, still wanted to hear what I had to say. The days ticked by, colder and darker. The streets glittered with lights I no longer noticed. I wrapped gifts for the few people I still considered close, my assistant Jordan, my 75-year-old neighbor who brought me soup when I had the flu last winter, and a barista at the cafe near my office who remembered my order down to the oat milk. I mailed a generic gift basket to my mother, knowing full well she'd raise an eyebrow at the vegan truffle spread and regift half the contents. And when Christmas Eve rolled around, I poured myself a glass of wine, put on a jazz playlist, and sat by the window watching the city blur in fog. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. It was like standing in a room you used to live in, now empty, walls stripped bare, echoes bouncing off old memories. I thought about the last Christmas we'd all spent together, 2 years prior, when I drove 4 hours to sit at the kids' table because someone forgot to set a place for me. My mother said it was an accident. My cousin whispered it wasn't. But then came Christmas night, quiet, slow, and strange. I was scrolling through Instagram, aimlessly, just filling time until the interview went live. And there it was. Natalie's post. The caption read, "Merry Christmas from our crazy bunch." So grateful for family and all this love under one roof. Tagged were all my siblings. My mother. Cousins. Even my dad's sister who supposedly couldn't make it because of knee surgery. They were all there. Wearing matching red pajamas, sitting around the dining table, arms linked, kids screaming, wine flowing. The fireplace was on. The house was full. And I wasn't even a name mentioned in the tags. I stared at it longer than I should have. The photo carousel kept flipping cookies, the family dog in a Santa hat, my brother's baby covered in tinsel, someone passed out on the couch. They weren't keeping things small. They were just keeping things without me. And still, I didn't say a word. Didn't comment. Didn't text. I just closed the app, turned off the music, and sat in the silence like it was an old friend. Because in that moment, something shifted. Not anger. Not pain. Something colder. Sharper. The kind of clarity that doesn't make you raise your voice, it just makes you change your plan. Because in less than an hour, I'd be live on national television, in a tailored blazer, talking about a multi-million-dollar acquisition that would make headlines for weeks. And while they toasted eggnog over turkey and gossip, the same girl they quietly pushed out of the frame would become the name people couldn't stop mentioning. And they wouldn't see it coming. Not until it was too late. It's strange how silence can feel louder than a shout, how something not said can echo for days in your head, louder than any insult or argument ever could, and that's exactly what happened to me in the hours and days that followed seeing that photo. The one with the matching pajamas, the glittering smiles, the crammed dining table that somehow didn't have room for me, and I found myself caught in this surreal space where I wasn't angry in the way you'd expect, wasn't pacing around my apartment or throwing things or drafting dramatic texts. No, what I felt was deeper than that, something bone level, something that curled around my lungs and made breathing feel like an effort, not because they lied, but because they didn't even bother to. That's what hit me hardest, not the exclusion itself, not being left out of a meal or a family photo or a bad holiday joke, but the simplicity of it all, the casualness, like it hadn't even taken a conversation. As if the decision had been made long before the text was sent, like my name hadn't even come up when they were planning it, because if they had at least lied, at least made some clumsy excuse or sent a guilty follow-up text, I could have held on to that. Could have at least believed there was a moment where someone hesitated, where someone asked, should we invite her? But no, they just went on without me, like I was a name scratched off a list months ago. I spent that night in a strange quiet, the city buzzing in the background through my thick windows, a muted hum of sirens and laughter and late-night deliveries, and I sat in that silence like it was a chair I'd been saving. Like I'd finally earned the right to sit alone and stop pretending that things were what they weren't, because the truth is, I'd spent years clinging to some romanticized idea of family, of obligation and unconditional love, and all those Hallmark card lies we're fed as kids. But when you strip it all down, when you really take a hard look at the dynamic, at the missed calls and awkward dinners and group texts where you're only addressed out of courtesy, you start to see things clearly, and that's what I saw that night. Not a misunderstanding, not a scheduling conflict, not a fluke, but a choice. They chose not to include me, not because of something I did, not because I made a scene or offended someone or crossed some boundary, but simply because I no longer fit, no longer served a function in the ecosystem of their shared lives. Because I had grown outside of their rhythm, outside of the kind of life they understood, and rather than stretch to include me, rather than try to meet me halfway, they simply decided not to bother. And what made it worse, or maybe better, depending on how you look at it, was the fact that I didn't rush to fix it, didn't start crafting some performative response or guilt-tripping anyone or demanding an explanation. I just sat with it, as ugly and bitter and cold as it was, and something in me settled, not with defeat, but with clarity, like a fog lifting, like a door closing for good. The next morning, I opened my laptop and went straight to work, not because I was trying to distract myself, but because work has always been the one space where things made sense, where effort equaled results, where there were rules and deadlines and measurable wins. Unlike family, where everything is unsaid and nothing is earned, only expected, so I leaned in, harder than before, reviewing briefs, signing contracts, fine-tuning every last detail for the interview that night, because now it wasn't just a job, wasn't just another appearance. It was the only table I had ever really been invited to, and this time, I wasn't going to show up quietly. Around noon, I got a notification on my phone, a calendar reminder from my assistant. Interview at 7 p.m. Arrive studio by 5:30. Hair/makeup confirmed. And for a moment, I just stared at it, not because I'd forgotten, but because it felt poetic somehow, that on the same day my family decided I wasn't worth a folding chair or a slice of dry turkey. A national network had decided I was worth a full segment, primetime, live, the kind of slot they give politicians or CEOs or once-in-a-decade innovators, and whether or not my family saw that, whether or not they even cared, it didn't change the fact that millions of strangers would be watching me. That night, listening to my voice, hearing my name, and maybe, just maybe, realizing that the person they had quietly pushed aside had turned into someone impossible to ignore. But even then, I didn't feel like I'd won anything, didn't feel triumphant or smug or vindicated. Instead, I felt this heavy, hollow satisfaction, like drinking cold water when you're starving. It fills you, sure, but it doesn't nourish. Doesn't fix what's missing, because at the end of the day, no headline, no spotlight, no polished blazer on national television can fill the space where a family should be, where belonging should live, and I knew that, deeply, painfully, but I also knew that chasing their approval wasn't going to fix it either. So I kept moving. I dressed carefully, chose a deep navy suit that I knew would read as calm and authoritative on camera, paired it with a silver chain my grandmother once gave me, the only real connection I still felt to that family tree, and as I stepped out into the cold city air, into the black SUV waiting to take me to the studio, I didn't look back, didn't check for texts, didn't wonder whether anyone had noticed I hadn't said a word. Because the next time they heard my name, it wouldn't be in a group chat. It would be on their televisions. And it would be the loudest silence I'd ever spoken. There's a moment, right before you go live on camera, when the world around you falls eerily still, not just quiet in the conventional sense, but the kind of suspended silence that feels like holding your breath underwater, where your heartbeat becomes the only sound you can hear and everything else, from the soft hum of the studio lights to the distant shuffle of technicians behind the curtain, fades into a muffled blur, like the world is watching you from behind thick glass. And for that brief, electrifying second, the weight of what you're about to do settles on your shoulders in full, undeniable form. As I stood in the green room that evening, the pale yellow walls closing in just slightly, my fingers absent-mindedly smoothing the fabric of my blazer, while a makeup artist dabbed powder on my cheekbones with the delicate intensity of someone painting the final strokes of a masterpiece, I was not thinking about the questions the host might ask or whether the lighting would flatter my features. I was thinking about the photo again, the one my sister had posted the night before, the one with everyone grinning and crammed into the family living room as if the absence of one person was so natural, so inconsequential, it didn't even merit explanation. And maybe that's why, as the countdown began in my earpiece and I stepped into the cool, overlit studio, heels clicking sharply against the polished floor, I didn't feel nervous or vulnerable or exposed in any of the ways people usually do before addressing millions of viewers. Instead, I felt something far more potent. I felt power, not the kind that comes from dominance or control, but the kind that's forged from years of being underestimated, overlooked, minimized into silence until eventually that silence becomes a weapon, one that slices through perception with the kind of precision no raised voice ever could. The host greeted me warmly, all charm and camera-friendly teeth, but behind his eyes, I saw what most people see when I walk into a boardroom or onto a stage, that flicker of surprise, the quick calculation, the realization that I am not what they expected, not the stereotype they had quietly constructed in their minds based on job titles or headshots or whispers in corridors, and I smiled back, not with smugness, but with the calm assurance of someone who no longer needs to explain her presence, someone who has already paid in full for her seat at the table. The lights went up, The cameras rolled, and just like that, we were live coast to coast. Tens of millions of homes tuned in, the kind of audience you can't even fully comprehend because it's too vast, too distant, too abstract to grasp in real terms, and yet, I knew in the back of my mind that somewhere, maybe even in that same living room where I had once been handed a paper plate while others used china, someone in my family might be watching, or maybe just hearing about it from a friend. Or maybe seeing the headlines online the next morning. Either way, I was no longer just a daughter or a sister or a niece. I was a name spoken with reverence in financial circles, a woman whose words now carried weight not out of obligation, but out of earned authority. The interview itself went exactly as planned, or perhaps even better, because when you're no longer trying to impress or gain approval, when your words are rooted in truth rather than performance, they tend to land with a resonance that can't be faked. We talked about the acquisition, of course, a strategic move that had been in the works for almost a year, one that would reposition our company as a major player in an industry still dominated by old money and older assumptions, and as I spoke, breaking down the vision, the risks, the long-term gains, I could see in the host's face that he wasn't just hearing numbers, he was witnessing a shift, a quiet dismantling of the archetype of who gets to lead and what they're supposed to look like. But what I didn't say, what I carefully left out of the segment, was the deeply personal undercurrent beneath every strategic decision, every sleepless night, every win, the truth that for people like me, who come from families that view ambition as a threat and independence as betrayal, success is never just professional, never just about revenue and market share. It's about reclaiming space you were told you had no right to occupy, about speaking fluently in a language you were never taught, about rising in full view of those who quietly hoped you'd shrink. The applause at the end was polite, as it always is in a studio full of staffers and interns and hired energy. But the energy I felt didn't come from their claps, it came from the vibrating hum of my phone, already starting to light up with alerts. Headlines being pushed out in real time, snippets of the interview being clipped and shared, the familiar ping of LinkedIn connections and congratulatory emails. But buried within the flood, beneath the professional cheer and media buzz, were a few messages that stood out like thorns in a bouquet. My cousin Sarah, the one who once told me I was too intense for a family game night, texting, "Saw you on TV, wow, you've really made it," followed by a heart. My brother Ben, who hadn't returned my last 3 texts, commenting publicly on the network's post, "That's my sister," proud moment, like we were close, like he had played any part in the long and brutal climb that led to this moment. And then there was Natalie, my sister, the one who sent the "keeping it small" message, the same one who posted the party without me. She sent a simple text, no emojis, no punctuation, just, "You looked really good tonight. Congrats." It landed like a pin dropping in a cathedral. I didn't respond. Not because I wanted to punish her, or prove anything, or assert some kind of superiority, but because there was genuinely nothing to say, nothing that wouldn't come off as either forced civility or cold dismissal, and maybe, just maybe, silence was finally the most honest thing I could offer her. That night, as I rode back through the city in the quiet hum of the car, still glowing faintly with studio lights, I watched the skyline blur past the window and realized that while I had been chasing achievement all these years, what I really wanted, deep down, was acknowledgement, not from the public, not from the industry, but from the people who had held my baby pictures and laughed at my childhood dreams, the people who should have seen the spark in me before it ever turned into fire. But they hadn't. And maybe they never would. And maybe, just maybe, that had finally stopped mattering. The day after the interview aired, the city felt different, not because anything had truly changed in the world around me, but because something had shifted internally, like a key had finally turned in a door I hadn't realized I'd been leaning against for years. A door that separated who I was from who I had been raised to believe I should be, and once it swung open, I wasn't even tempted to look back through the frame. I woke up that morning to a phone that was practically overheating from the notifications, a storm of messages from colleagues, industry insiders, distant acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years, and even some strangers who had caught the segment and felt compelled to reach out, as if my face and voice had cracked open something in them, a recognition, a reflection, maybe even a quiet solidarity. There were invitations to speak, to consult, to lead panels, to be the face of this new wave of women in power, and, while part of me appreciated the acknowledgement, the deeper part, the one still curled around that cold memory of being quietly erased by my own family, remained cautious, unmoved by external praise, because I had learned, over time and through painful repetition, that being seen by the world doesn't always make you seen at home. Somewhere among the chaos of congratulatory texts and scheduled calls was a message from my mother, one I read slowly, twice, because I couldn't quite tell whether it was genuine or just the familiar mixture of vague warmth and veiled criticism I'd grown used to. She had written, "You looked very elegant last night. Your father would have been proud. Everyone here watched." That was it. No mention of the omission. No apology. Not even a question about how I was doing. Just a short nod of acknowledgement, like tossing a dry bone to a dog that's learned not to beg. I didn't respond, not out of malice, but because I had nothing to give in that moment, nothing that wouldn't sound performative or brittle or worse, like I was still grasping for something I should have long since let go. It occurred to me that this was how people start becoming strangers to their own families, not through fights or distance, but through a long, drawn-out series of silences where words should have been, a slow erosion of intimacy disguised as politeness. Natalie messaged again that afternoon, this time a little longer, a little more carefully crafted, as if she'd sensed that her previous one-liner hadn't quite landed. She wrote, "I didn't know the interview was going to be such a big deal. You seemed really confident up there. We were all watching, and the kids thought you looked like someone famous. Sorry we didn't loop you in for dinner. Things got messy with planning, and it just kind of happened. Hope you understand." And there it was, that word again, hope, always the polite cousin of guilt, softening the blow of choices made without consideration. I read her message slowly, analyzing not just the words, but the spaces between them, the silences where the truth lived. What she was really saying wasn't that it just kind of happened. What she meant, whether she could admit it to herself or not, was that excluding me had felt easier, smoother, more comfortable than including someone who no longer fit their mold, someone whose presence had grown too sharp, too different, too difficult to explain to the others. What struck me most was how none of them, not my mother, not Natalie, not the cousins liking my LinkedIn post, none of them had actually acknowledged what had been done. They were treating it as a mild oversight, something forgivable, something that could be glossed over now that I had appeared on television in front of millions, as if success could be retroactively applied like salve to cover the wound they had left behind, as if my achievement somehow canceled out their erasure. And then, almost as if summoned by the weight of memory, I remembered something my father had told me when I was 17, during one of the rare afternoons he and I had spent alone together, a time before his illness took hold, when he still had a voice strong enough to say things that mattered. We had been sitting in the backyard, my notebook open on my lap, full of college brochures and plans that no one else in the family really wanted to hear about, and he had leaned over, looked me in the eye, and said, "You're not going to belong here forever, Alina. Some people are built for staying, and some are built for going. You're going. And it's going to hurt. But it'll be worth it." I had forgotten that moment, or maybe I had buried it, because remembering it now felt like someone had reached into my chest and gently untangled a knot I didn't know had been tightening all this time. He had known. Long before anyone else, my father had seen it, the inevitable fracture, the quiet distance I'd spend my life navigating, the grief of outgrowing the only place that had ever claimed to be home. And so, I did the only thing that made sense. I took a breath, stood at the window of my apartment as the sun dipped low over the skyline, and composed a single message, not a dramatic speech, not a confrontation, just a line I knew they would understand. One that left nothing open for debate or confusion. I texted the family group chat, "Thank you for watching the interview. I noticed who was there for dinner and who wasn't. I'm not angry. I'm just done pretending I don't notice." No one replied. Not Natalie. Not my mother. Not the cousins. Not even Ben, who had posted me like a trophy online the night before. The read receipts lit up one by one, quietly, like a row of flickering candles going out in reverse. And that was that, not a bang, not a storm, just a stillness that said everything I needed to hear. I turned off my phone, not in defiance, but in finality, like closing a book whose ending no longer surprises you. And for the first time in years, I felt no need to explain myself to anyone. There's something uniquely sobering about silence that follows truth, not the silence of uncertainty, not the kind that waits for a response or anxiously hovers between people hoping for reconciliation, but the deep, echoing kind that follows when a boundary is finally drawn, when a truth long buried under pleasantries and history and unspoken resentment finally breaks through the surface like a crack in the foundation, leaving everything that stood on top of it exposed and vulnerable. That was the kind of silence I had created with one sentence, not dramatic, not accusatory, just pointed and final, and in the hours that followed, as my message sat in that group chat like a stone dropped into still water, I felt the old instincts rise. The temptation to soften it, to follow up with something kind, something conciliatory, to reel it back in before it disrupted too much, but I didn't. Because this time, I had no intention of stepping back into a version of myself that made others more comfortable at the expense of my own dignity. Instead, I let the quiet speak, because in families like mine, where emotional honesty is treated like an uninvited guest and tension is smoothed over with casseroles and small talk, the one thing that truly shakes the foundation is when someone refuses to play along, when someone stops pretending that everything is fine and, worse, doesn't beg for understanding afterward. The next morning came without any reply, just another batch of passive notifications on social media, likes, shares, reposts of the interview. Snippets of quotes I barely remembered saying now being dissected and celebrated by people who had no idea what had prompted the steel in my voice that night. And, while part of me appreciated the validation, the bigger part of me remained strangely numb to it, because none of it addressed the root of what had really shifted inside me, that for the first time in my life, I had stopped seeking belonging where there was no room for me to be fully seen. Later that afternoon, while I was reviewing some follow-up press materials with Jordan, my assistant, I received a direct message that I hadn't expected. Not from a colleague or a former classmate or a distant connection trying to ride the wave of my moment, but from someone who had always hovered on the periphery of our family, someone who had never said much, but always seemed to notice more than he let on. My cousin Jack, older than me by a few years, mostly quiet, rarely present at family events, but never unkind, had written a single line, "You weren't wrong." We all saw it. Most were just too afraid to say it. I stared at his message for a long time, not because it shocked me. In fact, it made sense that Jack would be the one to reach out, if anyone did, but because it was the first true acknowledgement. The first time anyone from within the circle had dared to speak to the reality I had lived with for so long. I didn't respond to him either, not because I didn't appreciate it, but because I was still absorbing the weight of his words, the subtle shift they implied, that maybe I hadn't been the only one silently grieving the distance, the exclusion, the subtle manipulations that often pass for family loyalty in households like ours. Maybe others had seen it, felt it, been complicit in it, even if they lacked the language or the courage to name it. That night, as I sat on my balcony with a glass of red wine untouched on the table beside me, I started writing something in the Notes app on my phone, not a speech, not a press release, but a kind of letter, a private declaration to myself, not meant for public consumption, but as a way to process the tectonic shift I felt happening in my life. I wrote about the way certain holidays, year after year, had left me hollow despite the decorations and the smiles. I wrote about being the child who always knew too much, who read between the lines of adult conversations and felt the sting of being different. Before anyone ever said it aloud, I wrote about the moment I realized success wouldn't earn me love, that no amount of achievement would buy me a seat at a table that had already decided I didn't belong. And then, almost involuntarily, I wrote a single line at the bottom, a thought that had been sitting with me for days now, unformed until that moment. Sometimes the biggest act of love is walking away from those who only love you in pieces. When I looked at it, the truth of it hit so hard I almost laughed, because I had spent years trying to be small enough to fit into their idea of me, trying to be palatable, trying to make my ambition seem like a hobby and my independence seem like loneliness. And now, as I stared at the city glittering beneath me, the quiet hum of life continuing without apology or explanation, I realized I no longer felt any need to fit at all. The next weekend, Natalie posted a photo on her profile again, another family gathering, this time a New Year's brunch, complete with mimosas and a caption about fresh starts and gratitude. I wasn't tagged, of course, nor would I ever be again, not because they hated me, but because I had disrupted something they relied on, the myth that everything was fine, that we were close-knit. That family meant forgiveness, no matter how many times you were cut out of the picture. And by naming the wound, I had made it impossible for them to ignore. But here's the part they didn't expect, the part they'll probably never understand. I didn't speak up to be let back in. I didn't name the betrayal to force an apology or to restore some broken version of what once was. I did it because I was done lying to myself. I did it because silence had become too costly, and the space it left behind was now ready to be filled with something real. So no, I didn't reply to the brunch photo. I didn't scroll through the comments or let my imagination spiral into the familiar ache of what it felt like to be the one left out. Instead, I packed a weekend bag, turned off my phone, and drove north, no destination in mind, just the open road, my favorite playlist, and the quiet knowledge that I had finally outgrown the story they kept trying to cast me in. And maybe that's the most unexpected form of revenge, not the kind that slams doors or burns bridges, but the kind that simply moves on. The kind that leaves people stunned not by fury, but by peace. Because when you've spent your whole life waiting for someone to choose you, and then finally choose yourself instead, that's when the real story begins.